So in this video, we're going to look at public goods and common resources. Public goods are goods that basically you do not have to purchase to be able to actually use. Anyone can use them. And then common resources are resources that all of us have access to, such as oceans, in particular the fish within the oceans. And in looking at that, we'll look at kind of how those things have to be very carefully protected, or otherwise we'll basically use them all up pretty quickly. So we begin our discussion on public goods by defining what private goods are. That way we can tell the difference between the two. So private goods rival in consumption. So if one person has them, then another cannot. So if you take about the pizza, for example, if one person has that slice of pizza and they've eaten it, well, then that's one less piece you can have. So if we take, in this case, a 6-piece pizza, if I eat one piece, and that only means there's 5 available. So that one piece, of course, is no longer gone. It's been consumed. So the removal of a slice means it cannot be consumed by another person. Non-payers can be excluded as well. So in order to actually have access to the pizza, you have to have paid for it. Otherwise, it's you can't access it. So they're exclusive. So private goods are rival and exclusive. Same thing with movie tickets. You'll notice the admit one. So you have to buy a ticket in order to watch the movie. It's not like anyone can just go and watch it. You actually have to be approved. You have to purchase a ticket, so you have to be included. But not all goods are private goods, though. So now that we have an exact definition of private goods, in which private goods are rival and exclusive, we'll look at public goods. Once produced, they're available to all. It doesn't matter whether you paid for it or not. So everyone benefits from national defense or disease control. They don't have to pay for it to benefit from it. Simply living here in the United States gives them access to defense and gives them access to disease control, whether they pay for it or not. And the same thing with fireworks shows. If you think about like a fireworks show, like say 4th of July, Nashville fireworks show, the county itself pays for that show, and that show is available to all kinds of people because it's online, it's on television, but at the same time, people can come from other counties to watch it, and they never ever help pay for this. So fireworks shows are a public good. You can't prevent someone from benefiting from the public good. So private goods, when you think about them, they're non-rival. So everyone has access to them regardless of whether they pay for them or not. So regardless of the number of people who use the good, the quantity does not decrease from the next person either. So just because I attended the fireworks show doesn't mean that you, when you attend, are actually going to get less fireworks, because of the fact that it's a common good. It's a public resource, common, public good here for us. So public goods are non-rival and non-exclusive. Private goods are rival and exclusive. Public goods are non-rival, they're non-exclusive. They cannot be distributed through markets either, because the buyer isn't defined. The simple fact that you can have something without paying for it eliminates the ability of someone to actually sell that within a market. So you do not have to pay to consume. So when you think about public goods, they're non-rival, they're non-exclusive, you don't have to pay to consume, and everyone has access to them. Okay, so public goods do not have prices attached to them, so what happens? The market cannot ensure that the good is produced and consumed in the proper amounts. In other words, markets can't reach efficiency in markets with no prices. Well, public goods don't have prices, therefore market efficiency is something that cannot occur. So it results in market failure. Now, market failure occurs because the market cannot allocate resources efficiently. Now, remember, in order to allocate resources efficiently, you need some sort of price attached to them so that you know what you are producing and consuming. It simply just doesn't happen, because in a public good, every single person can consume whether they pay or not. So free resources cannot be allocated efficiently, and therefore, of course, market failure is inevitable. So when we look at the free rider problem, and a free rider is a person who receives the benefit of a good but avoids paying for it. So when we talk about public goods, everybody can access public goods. It doesn't matter if they pay or not. So it's like when you look at this picture here of this teamwork, and you notice these two guys here in whites with the hands in their pockets. So they're going to receive the benefit of this teamwork, even though they did actually nothing to help it. But because of the way the market is shaped, and because of the fact that there's no real market in terms of price, then this is perfectly acceptable. But now free riders exist because public goods are non-rival and they're not excludable. You can't keep those people from accessing the benefit because you don't have a price to set that says yes, it's excludable or no. Everyone gets to do it. So everyone can consume, no one can be excluded, and there's no incentive for anyone to pay for anything. Think about it like this. If you were going to be told that you could either pay $29 for some common good, or you were going to have to just give it for free, well, people are going to take it for free, people are going to give it. That's kind of how this ends up working, is there's no way to establish a price, so therefore it's just being given away as a public resource and a public good. So everyone can have a free ride. In a private market, the result will be a shortage. You can think about it like this: with there not being able to set a price, then for this resource, everybody wants it, but not enough people could get it. So it would result in shortages within private markets. And so the government would have to intervene to create market efficiency. So we have here what we call the public goods game. So you can see on one side we have cooperators. On the other side we have free riders. Now, notice that even though the cooperators are the only ones who are contributing to the public goods, notice that the beam here is balanced, because every single person, regardless of the number of contributors and regardless of the number of free riders, everyone benefits from this. So no, it's not like the cooperators are the only ones allowing to be benefited. Everyone benefits from a few people working. So when it comes to public goods, some people, the cooperators, contribute to the payment of public good, but everyone's receiving the benefit. This is why private markets don't supply public goods, because there's no money to be made from producing them. So a privately funded company will not enter the market to sell these types of goods, because they're not going to make any money, considering the fact that people can get this item for free. So how do we solve the free rider problem? Well, the easiest way to solve the problem would be taxing everyone. That way we ensure that everyone who's receiving benefit of the good is being taxed for it. That's the simplest way to solve the problem. And that would provide funding for the production of the public good. But however, is this the best thing to do? Is it the best policy to simply go in and basically regulate everything and create genuine markets on everything? Or is it sometimes easier with certain products just to allow everyone to have access to them? Well, the government will provide the common good if. So here's what the government decides on. So if the good ensures that total benefits outweigh total cost, then it's okay for everyone to be able to access it. So if total benefits are greater than total cost, in other words, if the benefit to the public is more than what it's going to cost them, then you might as well just allow it to be a free rider problem. If the benefit is reduced and is not as much as the cost, then there's no sense in doing it, because otherwise you're going to lose money. So total benefit greater than total cost means the government will provide the good that allows the free rider still to use it. Okay, so here's an interesting question. This is one, of course, that gets talked about a lot. So is welfare a public good? So do the benefits of the welfare system outweigh the cost of it? In other words, does the government provide welfare because its benefits outweigh its costs, or should everyone be taxed? What you have to understand now is, of course, everyone in America is taxed, but at certain tax brackets, in the lower levels, their income taxes they're not taxed at all because there's so little, or they're immediately refunded everything that they've been taxed for. In both of those cases, of course, those individuals are not actually paying for the welfare system. So the cost-benefit analysis is used to answer this question. And the answer is yes. The public good, welfare is a public good, so yes, it does outweigh the cost. Not all people contribute to the system, but you do not have to contribute to it to use it. And that's the thing, is the lowest levels of income in the United States aren't contributing to the payment of the welfare program. At the same time, they're also using it. So it would be a question of, are we just going to stop allowing those people to do so? And the answer to that question, of course, is no, we're not. Okay, so now let's turn our attention to common resources. So common resources are like public goods in the fact that they're non-excludable. They're available free of charge to anyone who wishes to use them. They are, however, rival goods. One person's use of the common resource reduces other people's use. So common resources are non-excludable. Anyone can use them who wishes to. However, when you use it, that's one less resource for someone else to use. So therefore, they are non-excludable, but they are rival. So So the use of common resources creates a special problem. They tend to be overused when they can be obtained freely. And that's kind of the thing here, is that anyone can gain access to them. Now, the problem with that is that they tend to be overused when that occurs. So, do we basically just revamp this whole thing? Do we prevent people from just freely accessing these resources? In some cases, it's not that easy. And then to kind of show you how this works, economists have developed what they call this tragedy of the commons, and it gives you an idea of the impact that common resources have, but also the impact that is had upon common resources. So, shared resources are depleted by individuals, acting on their own self-interest, even though they know. In other words, you go to the lake to go fishing. You know that for every fish you pull out of the water, that's one less fish someone else can have. But you're not worried about it because this lake is huge. So it's not like you're thinking, oh, I'm going to go catch the only fish in here. No, you know that all the fish you catch, that's one less for someone else, but because the lake is so big, you're going to act in your own self-interest and do it anyway. That's kind of what they're saying here. Now, obviously this policy is not in the best interest of the group, but that doesn't stop the individual. So it's like when you look at this tree here, basically if all of these people around here, they kept digging up the apple trees to get access to the apples because the apples were out in the open, well, eventually there'll only be one tree left. So you can see from this cartoon here, you've got all these guys standing around looking up at this apple tree, and it's the only one left. And essentially you can imagine it's a fight to the top. Whoever gets to the first gets that tree. The easier way, of course, would have been to do this would have just simply been to plant a tree for every tree you harvest, but I mean, it's not exactly like that's a plan that some people take into account. So let's look at this here. It says the tragedy of the commons idea also describes many environmental problems, like overfishing, which is going to be our primary example. So our fisherman says here, well, we'll all be better off if we limit our fishing so that there will be enough fish for next year. That's true. Is that going to happen though? Not necessarily. Out of the way, there's profits to be made. And that's the thing, is because fishermen are able to make a profit off of fishing, they will not just stop fishing so that there'll be no fish, because that goes against their old concept here, because that takes away from their profits. So these individuals want to fish, even though they know they could literally fish every fish from the ocean, they'll do it in order for them to survive and make profits. Like this guy here, each individual fisherman wants to maximize his profit, but too much fishing can destroy the fishery for everyone. And that's the ideal case, is that you've got one person that can ruin it for everyone, because that one person is just focused on their own self-interest. You know, down here, I like cheap electricity. I like cheap gasoline. I like cheap fertilizer. Unfortunately, they're not going to like rising sea levels. And we look at these kinds of things that are happening. You know, we like this, we like this, we like this. Well, what kind of damage is being done in our effort to gain access to those? And that's that self-interest issue. Is you can look at global warming today and you can say, okay, the temperature is rising. Well, you know, not all these cities are going to be flooded by the time that I'm too old to worry about it. So I'll just not worry about it. And that's what people say. What they're really saying is basically, it's not my problem, it's my kids' problem or my grandchildren's problem when New York City floods. That's not my issue, that's their issue. That's essentially what we're saying. And so that's why you have to look at this from the standpoint of a factory can produce a whole lot of goods. But in doing so, they're polluting, you know, the air. So you would ask this question of it and say, okay, well, how do we stop that? How do we keep this company in production without ruining the air? Because if we just allow them to, they're going to produce as much as they possibly can, because that means higher profits. So when we look down here, so it might even help us understand why entire economies can crash. And that's really a true perspective. There was a book by Jared Diamond called Collapse. It's a very, very good book. He looked at why societies collapsed. And one of the main focuses was on the Mayan empires, which literally more or less just disappeared off the map in the 12 to 1400s. And the biggest reason why is essentially because they grew too large, their population became too large for the environment around them to actually sustain them. So they were so successful at what they were doing that they literally destroyed what they were able to do. They produced so much food, and they were eating so much food, and they were getting larger, and then of course they needed more food, but it wasn't available, so they changing the lands and stuff, and essentially they just destroyed the area and ended up having to, they either died off or left. And that's what happens within this idea of the tragedy of the commons, is that we know we're screwing something up, yet we're doing it anyway. So I told you that with the tragedy of the commons, that fishing would be something we look at, and we're actually going to be able to graph and go in and look at this. So here's an example of how the tragedy of the commons works. So let's take this arc, one of these diminishing returns arcs, like we've been seeing quite often. And of course, one of the things we know with diminishing returns is that it'll increase eventually, it'll level off, and then if we continue to go, it'll actually decline. And that's the case here. So when we look at this tons of fish and the quantity of boats, as you increase the number of boats, notice that you increase the tons of fish per hour that are caught. Of course, eventually you're going to reach a peak at around 65 or so, where at 65 boats, they're catching essentially 130 tons of fish per month. Now, when they increase those number of boats past that number, what happens is they actually consume so fast that the fish aren't able to basically replicate, have more fish. In other words, then fishing goes down. So as the quantity of boats increases, the tons of fish per month caught increases until the maximum sustainable catch is reached, which is that dotted line, which is the absolute top of that curve. And so at that point, any other new boats cause the catching to the tons that are caught to actually go down. So you can see here in blue, all of that in blue there is negative. That is overfishing. So at that point, an increase in boats causes overfishing and the tons of fish decline. So you can see here this overfishing. So anything above a 65 in terms of boats, that creates overfishing because those fish are not able to spawn and have new fish quick enough. So how do we deal with the tragedy of the commons? Well, one way to deal with it is through property rights. Property rights help to prevent market failure because property rights obviously establish a price on resources. So its market failure results from the inefficient allocation of resources. The waste need to allocate resources efficiently. Property rights do that. So this is where private property comes into play. Privately owned resources are allocated efficiently, and the reason for that is we can put a price on them. So if the resources are not privately owned, it is up to the government to allocate them. Obviously, not all resources can be privately owned. For example, you can't control the ocean. You can't control the air. I can't just go buy the Atlantic Ocean, because if I could, then I could charge fishermen all kinds of rates and I'd be rich. We can't do that. So when you think about fishing, for example, or other types of resources that are like that, those types of resources simply cannot be purchased. So there's no way, of course, to allocate those resources efficiently from a property rights perspective. A second way to deal with them would be through quotas. So quotas are limits on how much of a good may be produced in a given time. And the government could place a quota on each fisherman, limiting their catch. But I want you to think about this for a second. So the government's going to place a quota on each fisherman, limiting their catch. Well, how many fishermen on this planet? And from that perspective, is every single government going to check them, or is it just the government in which the business is located? So quotas create inefficiencies since a cost to enforce them exists. Essentially, in order to enforce a quota, you're going to have all kinds of officials go around and get on these boats and check their catch, check numbers, check weights, all the time. It's going to have to be constant, because if they don't do it, then fishermen will ignore the quotas. And so as a result, common resource markets are already inefficient. The simple fact that we have an inefficient market and we're going to try to make that market more efficient with something that's inefficient with a quota, that's just not going to work. It doesn't work that way. So the problem is self-interest. Fishermen have an incentive to catch more fish. A quota is only going to work if we are taking the time to monitor all the time. Otherwise, they'll still continue to catch fish because the fish equal profit. And these fishermen, of course, want more profits. So the willingness to go over with incentives for greater profits. And that, of course, creates inefficiencies because that means it's going to cost us even more. So you have to think about it like this. You have all of these fishermen that are out there fishing. The government wants to prevent them from fishing by establishing quotas. Well, in order to enforce the quotas, the government must hire people, so they've got to spend money, to get on these boats and check the catch in order to make sure that these boats are staying within legal limits. Well, all that does is create a greater inefficiency because it costs us more money in the long run. Now we're paying not only from the standpoint of we're seeing overfishing, but we're also literally having to pay for those people to try and check those ships, and there's just too many to do it. So it's not a good solution. Okay, now the third way is probably the most effective way in dealing with the tragedy of the commons, and that is an individual transferable quota. So we're dealing with quotas again, but with a different way. So production limits that are assigned to individuals. In other words, each individual fisherman will have a limit set for them. Now they're free to transfer them to someone else. So the quotas are usually set by weight. So think about this. So each fisherman has a weighted quota. What fishermen would be given as a quota, then they say, okay, you can catch X amount of tons a month, but then they could transfer to another fisherman. In effect, what we're creating is a market for the quotas themselves. So if one fisherman wants to be able to catch more fish this month, they can sell their quota to someone else. So a market develops for transferable quotas in which fishermen sell their quotas to others at market price. Now this, of course, allows the government to create the quota, but also to make some revenue, because of the fact that they can actually place a tax on the sale or the transfer of these quotas. So it gives the government a way to try to pay, in a sense, for some of what's taking place. So the result is the development of an efficient outcome through market forces, because now there's a supply and demand not for the resources itself, but rather there's a demand for the quotas or the permits to catch X amount of fish per month. So for example, if you're the fisherman and it's December and you want to catch triple what your amount is, then you would have to purchase from someone within the market their quotas. And of course, the price of the quotas sets the demand. So we see a regular type of efficient market within the market for the quotas themselves. Now we still have to hire people to check the boats, of course, but at least we can hire those people with the revenues that come from the trade, from the taxes on the trades themselves.